The wind howled through the empty streets of Billings, Montana, on a December night so cold it seemed to bite at the bones. Ethan Parker stood alone at a bus stop, his breath forming fleeting clouds in the air. The city felt like a stranger to him, its towering buildings and neon lights a far cry from the quiet, pine-scented streets of his small-town Red Lodge. His hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, the only barrier between him and the frigid night. Around his neck, a thick, hand-woven shawl clung tightly, a reminder of the grandmother who'd made it. "It's all I've got left of her," he thought, his chest tightening. The shawl was more than fabric. It was a piece of his history, a tether to a life that felt like it was slipping away. Ethan was 34, but the weight of the past few years made him feel older. His family's furniture shop, Parker & Sons, had been a cornerstone of Red Lodge for 3 generations. His grandfather had built it from nothing, carving every table and chair with a craftsman's pride. His father had carried on the legacy, teaching Ethan the art of shaping wood into something that could hold a family's memories. But the world had changed. Big box stores and online retailers had chipped away at their business. And when Ethan's father passed away 5 years ago, the debts piled up faster than he could manage. The bank foreclosed on the shop last spring, leaving Ethan with nothing but a rented room, a toolbox, and the shawl draped over his shoulders. "I failed them," he thought, the words a bitter refrain. "Grandpa, Dad, I let it all go." Tonight, he'd come to Billings for a job interview at a chain furniture store, a last-ditch effort to keep himself afloat. The interviewer, a man in a cheap suit with a clipboard, had barely looked at Ethan's portfolio of handcrafted designs. "We're looking for sales experience, not woodworking hobbies," the man had said, dismissing him with a wave. Ethan had walked out into the cold, the rejection stinging more than the wind. Now, as he waited for the 10:15 bus back to Red Lodge, he felt the weight of his failures pressing down harder than ever. Across the street, a woman stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was out of place, dressed in a sleek black dress that looked more suited for a warm evening than a Montana winter. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands escaping in the wind. She shivered visibly, her shoulders hunched, her eyes scanning the street as if she were lost. Ethan watched her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "She's gonna freeze out here," he thought. The street was nearly deserted, the few passers-by hurrying past with their heads down. No one seemed to notice her. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't the type to insert himself into someone else's business. He was quiet, the kind of man who spoke more with his hands than his words. But something about the woman's vulnerability tugged at him. Maybe it was the way she stood, alone and out of place, like she didn't belong in this cold, unforgiving city any more than he did. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother, who'd always said, "Kindness costs nothing, Ethan, but it's worth everything." Before he could second-guess himself, he unwrapped the shawl from his shoulders, the cold biting into him instantly. He crossed the street, his boots crunching against the frost-covered pavement. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. The woman turned, her eyes wide and startled. Up close, Ethan saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her lips trembled from the cold. She was older than he'd first thought, maybe in her early 40s, with a quiet elegance that seemed at odds with her current state. "You look like you're freezing. Here, take this." He held out the shawl, its weight heavy in his hands. She blinked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. I can't take that," she said, her voice low but clear, with a polished edge that hinted at a life far removed from Ethan's. "It's yours." "It's fine," Ethan said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's warm. My grandmother made it. She'd wanted to keep someone from catching their death out here." He stepped closer, draping the shawl over her shoulders before she could protest further. The fabric enveloped her, its rich colors stark against her black dress. For a moment their eyes met, and Ethan saw something flicker in her gaze, something raw, unguarded, like gratitude mixed with disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers brushing the shawl's edge. "This is beautiful. Your grandmother must have been talented." "She was," Ethan said simply, a pang of grief tightening his throat. He stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide their trembling. "You okay out here? You look a little lost." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his intentions. I'll be fine," she said, but her voice wavered. "I just needed some air. I'll find my way." Ethan nodded, sensing she didn't want to be pressed. "All right, stay warm." He turned to walk back to the bus stop, the cold seeping deeper into his bones without the shawl. He didn't look back, but he felt her eyes on him as he crossed the street. Just another moment in a night that won't matter, he thought. The bus pulled up with a hiss, its headlights cutting through the dark. Ethan climbed aboard, the doors closing behind him, and the woman disappeared from view. Katherine Hale stood frozen under the street lamp, the shawl's warmth enveloping her like an embrace she hadn't felt in years. Her fingers traced the intricate patterns, each stitch a testament to care and skill. Who was that man? She wondered, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She wasn't used to kindness without strings attached. In her world, every gesture came with an agenda, every smile, a calculation. But this stranger had given her something precious, something that clearly meant the world to him, without asking for anything in return. Katherine wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at a gala across town, smiling for cameras and shaking hands with investors. As the CEO of Hale Hospitality, a chain of luxury hotels spanning 3 continents, she was a name people whispered with awe or envy. But tonight, the weight of that life had become unbearable. The gala had been filled with the usual crowd, sycophants and opportunists, all vying for a piece of her wealth or influence. Her family was no better. Her brother Richard had spent the evening dropping hints about needing another loan, his charm as hollow as ever. They only see me as a bank, she'd thought. Slipping out of the venue early, desperate for air, she hadn't planned to wander so far. Her driver was probably circling the city, frantic, but Katherine didn't care. She'd needed to escape, to feel like a person again, not a brand. And then the cold had hit her, sharp and unrelenting, reminding her how unprepared she was for this impulsive flight. She'd been standing on that street corner, shivering and lost, when the man had appeared. Ethan, she thought, recalling the name he'd mentioned in passing about his grandmother. His voice had been soft, his eyes kind, but guarded, like someone who'd been hurt but refused to let it define him. Katherine pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, the scent of wool and cedar lingering faintly. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the image of his face, the way he'd looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with a quiet understanding. I have to find him, she thought suddenly, the idea taking root with a force that surprised her. It wasn't just about returning the shawl. It was about understanding why a stranger's kindness had pierced through her carefully built walls. She glanced down the street, but the bus was long gone. The city felt colder now, emptier, but the shawl was warm, and for the first time in years, Katherine felt a spark of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Who are you, Ethan? She wondered, her breath catching. And why does this feel like the start of something I can't walk away from? Back in Red Lodge, Ethan sat in his cramped rented room above the town's only diner, the faint smell of grease and coffee seeping through the floorboards. The room was sparse, a narrow bed, a rickety table, and a single shelf holding his tools and a few sketches of furniture designs he'd never had the chance to build. He rubbed his hands together, still chilled from the night, and tried not to think about the shawl. It's gone, he told himself. Let it go. But the loss felt heavier than it should have, like he'd given away the last piece of his family's legacy. He thought of his younger sister, Lily, who hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. She'd left Red Lodge after the shop closed, blaming Ethan for letting it fail. You were supposed to keep it alive, Ethan, she'd shouted before storming out, her words cutting deeper than any blade. He hadn't tried to stop her. What could he say? She was right. He'd failed. But giving the shawl to that woman tonight, it had felt like something his grandmother would have done. Maybe that's enough, he thought, but doubt gnawed at him. Maybe it's all I've got left to give. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing Red Lodge in silence. Ethan didn't know it yet, but across the city, a woman with the means to change his life was already searching for him. And in that search, their worlds, divided by wealth, pain, and pride, were about to collide in ways neither could imagine. What happens when a single act of kindness ripples further than you ever expected? The morning sun barely pierced the heavy gray clouds over Red Lodge, casting a muted glow over the town's quiet streets. Ethan Parker sat at the counter of Mabel's diner, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The diner was a relic, its checkered floors scuffed and its red vinyl booths patched with duct tape. But it was the heart of the town. Locals shuffled in, exchanging nods and small talk, their voices a low hum against the clink of dishes. Ethan kept his head down, his sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing of a rocking chair. The lines were precise, each curve a testament to years of practice, but his pencil hovered, uncertain. What's the point? He thought. No one's buying handmade anymore. His hands, calloused from years of carving wood, felt restless without a purpose. 2 weeks had passed since that frigid night in Billings, since he'd given his grandmother's shawl to the stranger on the street. He tried not to think about it, but the memory lingered like a bruise, tender, impossible to ignore. The shawl had been one of the last things tying him to his family, to the life he'd lost when the bank took the shop. Now he was scraping by on odd jobs, fixing tables for neighbors, repairing fences, barely enough to cover rent. The weight of it all pressed on him, heavier than the winter clouds outside. "You're running out of time, Ethan," he thought, his jaw tightening. Out of options. Across the country, in a sleek Manhattan office overlooking Central Park, Katherine Hale sat at a glass desk, the shawl draped carefully over the back of her chair. The fabric looked out of place in the sterile room, its rich red color clashing with the chrome and white decor. Katherine's assistant, Clara, hovered nearby, scrolling through a tablet. "Your schedule's packed today, Miss Hale," Clara said, her tone clipped. "The board wants your input on the new resort project, and your brother called again. He says it's urgent." Katherine's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard always says it's urgent. Her brother's calls were a constant reminder of the family she distanced herself from. People who saw her as a means to an end, not a sister. She waved Clara off. "Tell him I'm busy." Her eyes drifted to the shawl, her fingers brushing its edge. For 2 weeks she'd carried it with her, unable to let it go. It wasn't just the craftsmanship, though the stitches were exquisite, each one a story of care. It was the man who'd given it to her, Ethan. His name had stuck with her, along with the quiet strength in his eyes, the way he'd walked away without expecting anything in return. In her world, where every gesture was a transaction, his kindness felt like a foreign language, one she desperately wanted to understand. "Clara," Katherine said, her voice steady but laced with purpose. "I need you to find someone for me, a man named Ethan from Montana. He mentioned a grandmother who made this shawl. That's all I have to go on." Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "That's not a lot, Miss Hale. Montana's a big place." "I know," Katherine said, her gaze unwavering. "But I trust you to figure it out. Use whatever resources you need, discreetly." She didn't explain why. She couldn't, not fully. Even to herself, the impulse felt reckless, almost foolish. But something about that night in Billings had cracked open a part of her she'd long buried. A part that yearned for connection, for something real. "I need to know who he is," she thought, "and why he matters so much." Clara was worth her weight in gold. Within a week, her network of private investigators and digital sleuths had tracked down Ethan Parker, a 34-year-old craftsman from Red Lodge, Montana. The report was thin but telling. Ethan had lost his family's furniture shop to foreclosure, lived alone in a rented room, and was known in his small town for his skill with wood and his quiet demeanor. The investigators had even found a grainy photo from a local newspaper, showing Ethan at a craft fair years ago, holding a carved chair with his grandmother beside him. Katherine studied the photo, her heart catching at the sight of his smile. Reserved but genuine, like he was proud of something bigger than himself. She could have sent the shawl back with a note, maybe a check to ease his troubles. But that felt wrong, impersonal. He deserves more than that, she thought. So she made a decision that surprised even her. She would go to Red Lodge herself. Not as Katherine Hale, CEO of Hale Hospitality, but as Kate Harper, a freelance journalist researching small-town artisans. It was a flimsy cover, but it would let her see Ethan in his world, to understand the man behind the gesture that had haunted her for weeks. When Katherine stepped off the bus in Red Lodge, the town felt like stepping into a postcard. Snow-dusted mountains loomed in the distance, and Main Street was lined with brick storefronts, their windows glowing warmly against the gray sky. She wore jeans, a wool sweater, and a practical coat, nothing like the polished attire of her usual life. The shawl was tucked carefully in her bag, a talisman of sorts. As she walked toward Mabel's diner, where Clara's report said Ethan often spent his mornings, her pulse quickened. "What am I even doing here?" she thought, but her feet kept moving. Inside the diner, Ethan was at the counter, his sketchbook open, his coffee untouched. Katherine hesitated at the door, watching him. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, but there was a steadiness to him, a quiet resolve that drew her in. She took a deep breath and approached, her voice light but practiced. "Excuse me, are you Ethan Parker?" "I'm Kate Harper, a journalist. I'm writing a piece on small-town craftsmen, and I heard you're one of the best." Ethan looked up, his green eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't used to strangers knowing his name, let alone calling him a craftsman. "You heard wrong," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "I'm just a guy who fixes things now and then." Katherine smiled, sliding onto the stool beside him. "That's not what the locals say. I heard you made a dining table for the Thompsons that's practically a work of art." She was bluffing, pulling details from Clara's report, but Ethan's expression softened, just a fraction. "They're exaggerating," he said, but there was a flicker of pride in his voice. He closed his sketchbook, his hands resting protectively over it. "What's this article about exactly?" Katherine leaned in, her tone earnest. "It's about people keeping old traditions alive, even when the world's moving on. I think your story could inspire a lot of folks." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did want to know his story. But the deception gnawed at her, a reminder of the walls she'd built around her own truth. Ethan studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. "She's not from around here," he thought, even in those jeans, too polished. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet intensity, like she was searching for something more than a story. "All right," he said finally. "I've got a couple hours before I'm due at a job. What do you want to know?" Over the next few days, Katherine became a familiar presence in Red Lodge. She followed Ethan to his odd jobs, repairing a porch railing, sanding a warped door, asking questions about his craft, his family, his life. Ethan was reserved at first, answering in short sentences, but her genuine curiosity wore him down. She had a way of listening, really listening, that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. He told her about his grandmother, who'd taught him to weave and carve, about the shop that had been his father's pride, about the ache of losing it all. He didn't mention Lily, his sister. The wound was too raw. But Katherine sensed the gaps in his story, the pain he didn't voice. For Katherine, being near Ethan was like breathing fresh air after years in a smog-filled room. He didn't know who she was, didn't treat her like a CEO or a paycheck. He was honest, unpretentious, and his hands moved with a quiet grace that reminded her of the shawl. He's more than he realizes, she thought, watching him sand a piece of oak, his focus absolute. But the lie of her identity weighed on her. What happens when he finds out? She wondered, her stomach twisting. The town, however, was starting to talk. Red Lodge was small, and strangers didn't go unnoticed. At the diner, Mabel, the owner, eyed Katherine with suspicion. "That journalist lady's asking a lot of questions about Ethan," she said to a group of regulars one morning. "Seems awful interested for a story." The gossip spread, fueled by rumors that Kate Harper might be a developer scouting land for a big project. Red Lodge had been struggling, shops were closing, young people were leaving, and the idea of outsiders meddling stirred resentment. The tension came to a head when Katherine visited Ethan's workshop, a rented shed behind the diner filled with half-finished projects and tools. He was showing her a chair he'd been working on, its arms carved with delicate vine patterns. "This is incredible," Katherine said, her fingers tracing the wood. "You could sell these in galleries, Ethan. People would pay a fortune." Ethan snorted, shaking his head. "People don't pay for this anymore. They want cheap, fast, disposable." But her words lingered, stirring something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. Before he could respond, the shed door swung open, and Mabel stormed in, her face flushed. "You need to tell us who you really are, Miss Harper," she said, her voice sharp. "Folks are saying you're with some big developer, here to turn our town into another strip mall. Is that true?" Ethan froze, his eyes flicking to Katherine. A developer? The idea hit him like a punch. He'd trusted her, let her into his world. Was it all a lie? Katherine's heart sank. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught. "I can't keep this up," she thought. "I'm not a developer," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. I'm just here for Ethan's story, I promise." It was half true, but the doubt in Ethan's eyes cut deeper than she'd expected. Mabel crossed her arms. "We've had enough outsiders poking around, taking what's ours. You better not be one of them." Ethan said nothing, but the silence was heavy. She's hiding something, he thought, his trust fraying. But what? That night, Katherine sat in her motel room, the shawl spread across the bed. She'd come to Red Lodge to return it, to thank Ethan, but now she was in too deep. "I have to tell him the truth," she thought, her chest tight. But the truth meant admitting who she was, a woman whose wealth and power would change how he saw her. She'd seen the suspicion in his eyes today, the same wariness she'd felt from others her whole life. "He'll think I'm just another rich person trying to buy his trust." Across town, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He wanted to believe Kate, but the rumors had stirred old wounds. Memories of the bank, the foreclosure, the feeling of being used. "She's different," he told himself, thinking of her quiet laughter, the way she'd listened to him talk about his grandmother. But doubt lingered, sharp and persistent. What does she really want? As the snow fell outside, both Ethan and Katherine were caught in the same question. Could they trust each other, or would the truth tear them apart before they'd even begun? When the past you're running from meets the future you're afraid to face, what do you hold on to? The snow had stopped falling over Red Lodge, but the air remained sharp, carrying the promise of a long Montana winter. Ethan Parker stood in his workshop, the shed's single bulb casting shadows over a half-finished table. His hands moved mechanically, sanding the wood, but his mind was elsewhere. Kate Harper, or whoever she really was, had left a crack in his carefully guarded world. Her questions, her quiet encouragement, had stirred something in him. A flicker of hope he'd thought long buried. But Mabel's accusations at the diner lingered, feeding his doubts. Is she just another outsider, taking what she needs and leaving us behind? He wondered, his grip tightening on the sandpaper. The wood beneath his hands was smooth, honest, unlike the uncertainty that had settled in his chest. Across town, in the dim light of her motel room, Katherine Hale sat on the edge of the bed, the shawl in her lap. Her fingers traced its patterns, each stitch a reminder of the man who'd given it to her without a second thought. She'd come to Red Lodge to return it, to understand Ethan, but now she was tangled in her own deception. I can't keep lying to him, she thought, her stomach twisting. But the truth, her identity as Katherine Hale, CEO of Hale Hospitality, felt like a wall she wasn't ready to climb. She'd seen the wariness in Ethan's eyes yesterday, the same look she'd faced from people who only saw her wealth. He's different, she told herself, but will he still trust me when he knows? The next morning, Katherine made a decision. She couldn't leave Red Lodge without telling Ethan the truth, but she needed to show him she meant no harm. She called Clara, her assistant, and gave instructions that would have raised eyebrows in her Manhattan office. Find out everything you can about Red Lodge's economic struggles, she said, and look into the developer rumors. I want names, plans, anything concrete. Clara's silence on the other end spoke volumes, but she didn't question the order. Katherine hung up, her resolve hardening. If I'm going to stay, I'm going to help. For Ethan, for this town. Ethan was at Mabel's diner when Katherine walked in, her presence drawing glances from the regulars. She wore the same jeans and sweater, but there was a new determination in her eyes, her voice steady. I owe you an explanation, she said, her words cutting through the diner's hum. I'm not a journalist. My name's Katherine Hale, and I run a company, a big one. I came here because of the shawl you gave me that night in Billings. I needed to know who you were. Ethan's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Katherine Hale. The name hit him like a stone. He'd heard it before, on the news, in business articles about luxury hotels. His jaw tightened and he set the cup down hard. So what, you're slumming it, seeing how the other half lives? His voice was low, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. She lied to me. Katherine flinched, but held his gaze. No, Ethan. I came because what you did that night, it meant something. It reminded me of a kindness I haven't felt in years. I didn't tell you who I was because I didn't want you to see me as money. I wanted you to see me. Her words hung between them, raw and unguarded. Ethan wanted to stay angry, to push her away, but the vulnerability in her eyes stopped him. She's scared, he realized. Scared I'll reject her. He thought of his sister Lily, of the way he'd let her walk away without fighting for their bond. He wouldn't make that mistake again. All right, he said finally, his voice softer. But no more lies. If you're here, be here for real. Katherine nodded, relief flooding her. I am. And I want to help, Ethan. Not just you, but Red Lodge. I know about the developer, Carson Realty. They're planning to buy up half the town for a commercial complex. I can stop them, but I need your help. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Carson Realty had been a shadow over Red Lodge for months, their representatives sniffing around, offering lowball prices for family businesses. The thought of them bulldozing the town's history made his blood boil. But trusting Katherine meant letting go of his pride, accepting help from someone whose world was so far from his. Can I do that? He wondered. Can I let her in? Over the next week, Ethan and Katherine worked together, their partnership tentative but growing stronger. Katherine used her resources to dig into Carson Realty's plans, uncovering a scheme to exploit Red Lodge's struggling economy. They were targeting the town's historic district, including the land where Ethan's old shop stood. Katherine proposed a counterplan, a community initiative to revive local crafts, using Ethan's skills as the cornerstone. She offered to fund it, not as charity, but as a partnership. Your work could bring this town back to life, she told him one evening in his workshop, her eyes bright with conviction. Let me help you make that happen. Ethan hesitated, his pride warring with the spark of hope her words ignited. Grandma would have wanted this, he thought, remembering her hands weaving the shawl, her voice urging him to keep creating. Okay, he said finally, but this is for Red Lodge, not just me. As they worked, their connection deepened. Katherine shared pieces of her own story, her manipulative family, the loneliness of her success. Ethan opened up about Lily, the sister he'd lost to his own stubbornness. One night, as they sat in the workshop, a single candle flickering between them, Katherine handed him the shawl. "I brought it back," she said softly, "but I think it belongs here with you." Ethan took it, his fingers brushing hers. The touch sent a jolt through him, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "She sees me," he thought, and for the first time, he let himself believe it. But trouble was brewing. Carson Realty caught wind of Katherine's involvement, and their CEO, Victor Carson, wasn't one to back down. He spread rumors that Katherine was buying influence in Red Lodge, turning the town against her. At a tense town hall meeting, Mabel stood up, her voice shaking. "We don't need some city millionaire telling us how to live." The crowd murmured agreement, their eyes on Katherine. Ethan felt the room shift, the weight of their suspicion. He stood, his voice steady. "She's not here to take anything. She's here to give us a chance. You don't have to trust her yet, but trust me." His words swayed some, but not all. Katherine felt the sting of their rejection, but Ethan's defense anchored her. "He believes in me," she thought, her heart swelling. Maybe that's enough. Months later, the night of Hale Hospitality's annual charity gala arrived in New York City. The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos, the air thick with wealth and ambition. Katherine stood at the podium, her presence commanding, but her eyes searched the crowd for one person. Ethan was there, uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, his hands shoved in his pockets. He'd come at her insistence, though he felt out of place in her world. Katherine took a deep breath and began her speech. "Tonight, we're launching a new initiative to support small-town artisans, starting in Red Lodge, Montana," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is inspired by a man who reminded me what kindness means. Ethan Parker gave me something priceless, a shawl woven by his grandmother, a gift given without expectation. That act changed me, and I hope this initiative will change lives in his town and beyond." She gestured to the side, where a display held the shawl, now restored and framed beside a plaque honoring Ethan's grandmother, Eliza Parker. The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan barely heard it. His eyes were on Katherine, her words sinking into him. "She's giving me back my family's legacy," he thought. After the gala, they stood on a balcony overlooking the city, the shawl now draped over Katherine's shoulders at Ethan's insistence. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice low. "The shawl, the initiative, why me?" Katherine smiled, her eyes soft. "Because you saw me, Ethan. Not the CEO, not the money. Just me. And I see you." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "I'm not good with words, Katherine, but I'm starting to think you're my home." Their lips met, tentative at first, then sure, a promise sealed in the quiet of the night. Back in Red Lodge, the community craft school opened its doors, a restored version of Parker and Sons at its heart. Ethan taught classes, his hands guiding others as his grandmother once guided him. Katherine split her time between New York and Montana, her presence a bridge between worlds. The town began to heal, its streets buzzing with new life. Even Mabel softened, offering Katherine a slice of pie at the diner with a gruff, "You're all right, city girl." One evening, Ethan found a letter in his workshop, tucked inside the shawl's frame. It was from Lily, his sister, asking to come home. Katherine must have found her, he thought, tears pricking his eyes. He looked out at the town, at the lights glowing against the snow, and felt something he hadn't in years. Real wealth isn't in what you have, but in the kindness you give and the lives you change.